Ciao a tutti, siamo Rachele, Giovanni e Giacomo dell'Informazione Giovane e abbiamo deciso di intervistare due ospiti speciali che adesso si presenteranno per parlarvi un po' dell'Australia Day. Vi spiegheremo adesso brevemente di cosa si tratta e approfondiremo grazie alle esperienze personali delle nostre ospiti speciali.
My name's Mika. I live on the Sunshine Coast in Australia, in Queensland. Yeah, that's me.
How old are you?
Oh, I am 19.
My name's Yvette Teichmann and I live on the Sunshine Coast, and I am a teacher of art and English, and I recently did a big trip around Australia with my family. And do you want me to tell you how old I am?
We cannot ask that.
Well, interestingly enough, I will be 44 next week on Australia Day.
So as a first question, I'd like to ask you what happens on the 26th of January and what celebration is that and what kind of celebration it is?
Okay, so what happens on the 26th of January, which is currently still known as Australia Day, there are citizenship ceremonies. They give out their Order of Australia awards like Australian of the Year and Queenslander of the Year, and that's a really, really great part of the day, and it's all, you know, televised, and then, you know, I think in a more personal sense, people sort of, you know, they get together, have parties, go to the beach and things like that. And I think most people have, up until recently, just sort of thought of it as an extra public holiday where they, you know, have a few drinks in the sun, to be perfectly honest. Yeah. But it's definitely evolving, which is a good thing, a really good thing.
Yep.
I think, yeah, definitely what Ms. Teichmann was saying. I also think, especially among younger people, it's like in two ways. In one way, it's not it's not necessarily about where Australia Day originated from. It's more, yeah, like what Ms. Teichmann was saying about it kind of being an excuse to get together and have a day off, and yeah, things like that. And I suppose kind of celebrate like the Australian spirit, which is a lovely idea, but not so lovely when it's like originated from what Australia Day has originated from. I think it kind of gets a little bit lost in translation sometimes.
And do you like celebrate the day? How would you, what would you do on a typical Australia Day? Meet your parent, your relatives, friends, go to the beach?
So I always see my family and stuff, but, you know, I think that's because it's also my birthday, so I always see the family and everything. But when I was living away from my family, you know, and I was in my 20s, and I would probably be one of those people having plenty of drinks in the sun, you know. So yeah, it's one of those days where it's had a long sort of history of what it's meant to be for everybody, which is like a day to celebrate, well, really how lucky I think we are here to have, you know, what we've got, and to see more people from around the world come and settle here as well, which is, you know, we're all, apart from the first Australians, we're all, you know, from somewhere else in the globe. So that I think is a big part of it, that you've got, you know, Australian voices and faces that are from the whole around the world, which is really good.
Yeah. I would say usually for me what's happened previous years, it'll be like more of a friends sort of oriented day where maybe a friend would hold a party or you would all go to the beach together, and it's one of those days where you might all dress up in like yellow and green and red and blue, like Australian colours and that kind of thing. But I would say this year definitely, like, I don't have any plans for Australia Day because, like, I think for me this year it's become a lot more apparent the controversy that's around it and like the bigger meaning that's behind it. And a lot of my friends are the same. Like, I haven't heard of hardly any really like get-togethers happening on Australia Day because everybody's so aware that it means different things to different people. And I think this is probably the first year that I've noticed it the most. Yeah, which is really interesting.
And we wanted to ask, Australia Day is, it marks the anniversary of the arrival of the first fleet of British colonizers. But from the Aboriginal people perspective, it's something different. As a matter of fact, they call it Invasion Day. Can you explain us why, and tell us a little bit about what has been for Aboriginal people?
Yeah, okay. So as I said before, it's not a new concept to try and change this idea of Australia Day to trying to recognise, you know, the dark truths that you know, that as soon as the British came to Australia, there was a civil war that lasted, well, you know, some say it's still lasting. And in 1938, that was the first time that there was protests against having it as Australia Day to celebrate, you know, patriotically, basically white settlement here in Australia, and they wanted to call it a day of mourning. And so, and then I think I've heard it should be called not just Survival Day, Invasion Day. There's lots of different things, and it's just an attempt to try and get some recognition for you know, some government policies that were pretty devastating to Aboriginal people. So you know, eventually, as I said to Gio the other day on the email, that I feel optimistic that we'll get it right as a country. But yeah, I mean, even when you have our Prime Minister who has a very shallow understanding of it appears that he has a very shallow understanding of Australian history, just with some of the, you know, remarks that he makes. And I think last year there was something said about slavery, and how one of his remarks was that, we can be proud that we never had slavery in Australia, and that's just wrong, because there were Aboriginal people taken out of their areas as slaves by chains around their necks and made to walk to settlements well away from where they were from, and forced to dive for pearls and, you know, very dangerous things like that they would send Aboriginal people out to do. So when you've got a Prime Minister who doesn't get any of that, I think we've got a long way to go.
There's lots of talk as well. I'm not sure if you guys have heard about it, but there's a big push for like changing the date of Australia Day as one of the big things of recognition. Like people are pushing for change the date of Australia Day so that we celebrate what Australia stands for, and like the culture and the like everything that we think like we love about Australia, celebrate it on a different day, and leave what we know, like the 26th, leave Australia Day as like a day of recognition of what happened and what it means to the Indigenous community, and like leave it as a day of understanding that, and then have another day where we can all be together and celebrate what we all love about Australia, which personally I think that makes so much sense to me. Yeah.
Rachel, you wanna?
Yeah. Okay. So, for the next question, we wanted to know if, according to your personal experience, there are differences between Aborigines and white Australians, and we would like to know how do the two cultures coexist, and we wanted to focus on religion.
So the two cultures coexist fairly separately. Like there's still most Indigenous people live in remote areas, and especially in places like Northern Territory and Western Australia. Not necessarily in the places where their forebears were from. They could have been moved at some stage by, you know, some white government policy that would have thought it the best thing to do. And I feel like their existence has been pretty rocked by white government policy, thinking that they know what's best for these people. And you know, I think it was apparent from, you know, just reading accounts of what the British thought of the Indigenous people when they got here, is that you had two, I don't think you could find two cultures more different. And there was very little understanding or, you know, even a want to understand it. Yeah.
In terms of like your question, do we think like white Australians versus Indigenous Australians, do we see like them as different? I would say, like, personally, I like as people, absolutely not. Like people are people, absolutely not. But like Miss Teacher was saying, like the culture is so different. But the way I view it is like culture is so different between so many different types of people that, yeah, it's like as people and as humans, so much the same, exactly, like equal, perfect, yeah. But yeah, like Miss Hitchin was saying, I think the culture is the big thing, and I think there's definitely been a lot of work into like trying to understand Indigenous culture a lot more and like educate ourselves on it. But yeah, definitely, I think like with those remote communities, like Miss Hitchin was saying, I think there's still so much that like the general population don't know about that kind of way of life. But in saying that, there's plenty of Indigenous people who aren't in those remote communities and that are just every like day to day with us. And I would say especially like that, I don't see a whole lot of difference. But yeah, their culture, which is like so important, and there's a reason like it's so important to them. And so like I think it's important for us to understand that as well. Try and keep continuing to understand as much as we can.
So, as you said, understanding cultures is like the key to integration and coexistence of more cultures. But do you think there are other ways to reach a good life living together in one land? And what can the solutions be to really coexist, not just by standing on the same land, but really cooperating for a commonwealth that can make all cultures in one land live together, for one another?
My answer is probably almost too simple, but I would say it comes down to every single person, no matter who you are, no matter what culture you are, being willing to say, hey, all these people are exactly like me, no one's better, no one's worse, nobody's less or more. I just want us all to, like, why wouldn't we all get along? Why wouldn't we all live together? Why wouldn't we respect each other's views? And I know it's probably too simple and it's not an easy fix like that, but that's just my view on it.
It's not as simple as you think, I reckon.
No. Yeah, that was well said, Tamika. I mean, you know, if you could strip back, you know, the things that supposedly make us different, you know, I think that would be really, you know, working towards, you know, having more peace. But, you know, I think it's just seeing difference as not something to be feared as well. You know, difference is a good thing. It's, you know, it's what makes our world what it is. And yeah, I think that everyone should just be able to embrace the differences between cultures and, you know, not have some kind of superiority, you know, creep into it, which I think is a very human thing, unfortunately. Yeah.
I wanted to ask one more question. Indigenous populations in Brazil, like the Panerai people, have managed recently to create bonds with important deep stars that have helped them to acknowledge their heritage in their country, so Brazil, and have helped them to make their voices count to the government. And so in the end, they managed to regain possess of a big area in the rainforest. Has this happened to Aboriginal people too? Do they have specific areas of the country where they can live in reserves freely, basically? Or this is not a thing in Australia for Aboriginal people?
Yeah. Well, there has been the turning over of the idea of terra nullius, which was the original, I suppose, excuse for the British to come down and just put down the flag and say, I claim this for the Crown, is that terra nullius meaning land belonging to no one. So that was overturned by the Mabo case in the 90s, where Eddie Mabo, who was a Torres Strait Islander, he owned part of his land on Murray Island, and there were fish traps there, and the fish traps had been there, and they're tidal sort of nets built by rock out on the shoreline, and they had been in his family for, you know, generations. You know, everybody had always remembered that being their piece of land. So he took the Queensland government and then the Australian government to court, and that was overturned. So there was no longer this idea that the Indigenous people didn't own the land, although they do see themselves as belonging to the land as opposed to owning it. But I think it's that very powerful thing to say, yes, we were here and we did have a long history here before white rule came along, you know. But I think,
sorry,
you go. Sorry, no, you're right.
I was going to say, there's also, you guys probably noticed it when you're in Australia, but there's a lot of focus these days on recognition of what, so all parts of Australia were known as a certain, like, known as belonging or, yeah, being home to a certain group of Indigenous Australians. So they were all, like, separated into different groups or tribes, and yeah, so I think, like, today there's a lot more focus on, like, educating yourself on what Indigenous land you're standing on, like, despite it not necessarily being, yeah, like, despite us now owning some of the land and things like that, it's a lot of focus on, yeah, like acknowledging what Indigenous groups' land you're standing on. And I know, so, like, in school we did it, at uni we do it. Even I've noticed some people have started, it's such a small thing, but I've noticed some people on their Instagram posts, you can put, like, a location, and I've noticed some people that I follow have started to put their location as the Indigenous name of the land, which I thought was really cool. Yeah, and I was a part of this group, and it was like an organised thing where we wrote letters to each other, totally not related to any, like, Indigenous Australians at all, just letters to each other. But somebody had an idea, why don't we write the address and then write the Indigenous land that we're sending it to. So I think there's like a few more things like that, like arising these days to show that kind of acknowledgement. Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if you have the answer because I already asked Mika, so it's for you, Miss. When I was there as an exchange student, it was the beginning of September, and once I went to Coulon Beach. It was sunrise. It was before sunrise, and there were some sort of rites, Aborigines rites. And I was just wondering if you know what they were for, because I can't remember.
Riots?
Yeah, it was sort of like, not riots, like RITES.
Rights.
Yeah.
Okay. At Coulon.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a ceremony?
Yeah, it was a sort of ceremony, and there was a fire, and they were playing and dancing, and they were telling history, like some stories about their history, and I just can't remember what they were for. I don't know.
September. It could have been for either, actually, well, National Sorry Day is in May, but it could have been for Reconciliation Week. It could have been for that, or I think Mabo Day is in September as well. Probably Reconciliation Week.
And what is that?
So that's a week that's been put aside to celebrate Indigenous culture, and along with Sorry Day, which is in May, it's devoted to, especially in schools, trying to focus on the original culture of Australia and recognising it as the first culture. And I think that's the idea. But reconciliation, of course, means to reconcile the past, to reconcile differences. And, I think at this point in time, that's just a word they put on the week. I don't feel like anything is really done to reconcile anything. That's my feeling on it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was another moment of my experience because it was completely different from what I do here. And especially considering that we know nothing about Aborigines or your culture, at least I didn't know anything before coming there, because in school we don't talk much about it. We talk a lot about Europe, of course. We know something about the USA, but we know so little about Australia, or in general also Asia, Oceania, all that part of the world. And I think it's a shame because when we were organizing this meeting with you guys, we were talking about how much we know about like apartheid in South Africa, but we don't know anything about differences between Aborigines and white Australians. I don't know if it's right to call them so, but you know what I mean. So it's very interesting. Everything you tell us is very interesting for me.
Thank you.
So one thing, so both of you have gone to the same school, Miss Teichmann as a teacher and Mika as a student. So two different roles living in the same environment. And so we've got two questions, but about the same thing. So I'll do the one to Miss Teichmann and then Jack can do the one to Mika. And the question to Miss Teichmann is, at the entrance of the school, and maybe at the entrance of every school, there are three flags. So Australian flag, the flag of Aboriginals, and the flags of Torres Strait Islands, if that's the name. So I wanted to ask if these symbols are just some symbols, or is it like the beginning of a path of integration, and what the integration is like at school, and if you notice differences in learning and in groups that are within school, and all these dynamics inside school.
Okay, so I feel like it is still evolving, and it's working past just being symbolic. I think that also I've seen when the three flags are together, the national flag with the Union Jack on it is always a tiny bit higher. I've seen that a couple of times. I don't know if Mika's seen that as well, because it's supposed to represent, you know, that Union Jack and the Australian flag is supposed to represent all of us, and then you've got the two flags either side. And that's the notion. But yeah, well, in terms of schools and the integration of Indigenous kids, they're very much a minority outside of their communities, and I know that there are some programs that we've got access to give the Indigenous kids just the edge that they might not otherwise have. And even though we think, oh, you know, some Indigenous kids who are probably, you know, their great-great-grandmother might have been Indigenous, and, you know, how does that affect them in their lives today? And when you put together the folio to have those kids get some funding every year, when you look through their profile, and they actually do have a range of disadvantages, either in their family situations or just disabilities that they've faced in their learning. I think it really opened my eyes when I was involved in getting these scholarships for our kids, and this has only been in the last 2 years, that you're doing these applications and you actually don't realise how long-reaching the disadvantages are for kids that, you know, have come down the line, and it's still there, you know, and you might not even pick those kids out as Indigenous either. Do you know what I mean? I mean, they don't have the obvious hallmarks of being an Indigenous person that you know, the physical ones. So that's been an interesting thing for me, is that there is still that disadvantage that comes through, and that's, you know, that's something that these kinds of programs are trying to attack as well, are trying to rectify, just trying to give them that little leg up.
Yeah, we wanted to have the perspective of Mika on the same issue. So if she has Aboriginal friends, first of all, if Aboriginal people tend to stick together to support each other, or they can normally be met at school for anyone.
Yeah.
Or they have different schools, and
yeah.
Or they don't go to school, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. In terms of, do I have friends who are Indigenous? I do. But it's like Ms. Teichmann was saying, it's more so like down the line. So I know, like, there's a friend of mine, she's a very, very proud Indigenous person. She is always like sharing her culture with us, and like she's very happy if we ask her questions about it. But she's got white skin. She, like, if you just looked at her, you wouldn't think she was Aboriginal, but yeah, she has absolutely super strong culture, and yeah, so I definitely do. But I think, and yeah, through school there was definitely some Indigenous kids that I was like, I associated with, I wasn't necessarily friends with, but that was just because like my friend group wasn't with their friend group, but it wasn't because they were Indigenous and I wasn't. It was just, yeah. in terms of like, do Indigenous kids at schools stick together? I think in a way they do, but I think it more stems from schools often have programs of support, like Miss Teichmann was talking about, for Indigenous students, and so they're brought together by the school, which means they spend time together, which means they become friends. I don't necessarily like, and they're brought together because they are Indigenous, but I don't necessarily think, like, if that program didn't exist, for example, I don't think they would just like instinctively all join together kind of thing. I think it's because they've been brought together through a program. But then in the same breath, I don't think they necessarily stick to that kind of group and don't make their own friends or anything. It's just like an extra group that they have. From what I saw when I was in school, it was kind of like they had that group, and that was a great support network because they could probably relate like to each other about a lot of things that perhaps maybe we can't relate to. But I think, yeah, there's like an added friend group, not necessarily like their only friend group sort of thing. Yeah.
I think the experience Miss Teichmann has done during her travel with her family through Australia has been a wonderful experience where, as you were saying before, you learned a lot of things and you got to know a lot of culture and differences. So I'd like to know, in general, what you were hit by the most, the things that you saw and the things that you learned, and how you have been enriched by this travel.
Oh, I couldn't list the ways that I've been enriched by that trip, but in terms of looking at Indigenous communities and just trying to get some tiny bit of perspective that, you know, a white girl from Brisbane could get, is that how remote and how far away from, you know, the East Coast and the main centres and populations of Australians, you have to go a long way to go to some of these Indigenous communities, and you know, they're tucked away there, and I think that can only be a good thing, because the further away they are, the more they can be left alone. You know what I mean? In terms of how it enriched my teaching, I obviously saw heaps and heaps of Indigenous rock art, and just amazing. Not just painted, but engravings and like rock formations that have been there for thousands of years, and you know, and I think the big thing that you take from it is just how massive Australia is. And you know, and when you look at the map of Australia, there are something like 800 plus Indigenous nations, so you're talking about a huge diversity of languages and customs, and you know, in terms of their belief systems as well, like it's just so varied, just so massive. Like to put them in the one group as, you know, Aboriginal people or Indigenous people, you know, you think, oh, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are two different groups. Well, you know, even Torres Strait Islanders, you can have different, you've got 4 or 5 different languages in the archipelago of the Torres Strait, and you've got completely different cultures going on between them. And they're another fascinating culture. I mean, it was before missionaries came and saved them from themselves. They were headhunters. They used to have inter-island warfare, and it was quite a savage culture, you know. So to know a little bit about any of them would be, you know, a real gift.
We thank you very much. I think we covered a lot of issues, maybe not exhaustively enough, but if anyone wants to go deeper, I think the web is the right place to go. And I don't know if you want to add anything to conclude this video, if you have anything in mind.
I think going forward, it would be silly of Australia not to have Indigenous people recognised in their constitution, in our constitution. It doesn't predate white settlement, and that is that's part of the ill will towards something like Australia Day, because yeah, for obvious reasons, they need to be embedded in the history and the you know, and the constitution in general, because they're not. It's hard to believe.
And I think as like I've mentioned before, but on like a more personal view, I think it's as like a nation, there's still a lot of work to do, but I think among the people that I associate with, it's really incredible to see just the impact of, you know, just the small amount of people that I know, so many of them putting out posts and things to say, hey, reconsider celebrating Australia Day. Like if you have plans to have like a party or something on Australia Day, maybe like reconsider it and move it to another day, or just things like that, which I think, although there's a lot of work to do as a whole country, I think individual people are getting really, really close to what I think is a very cool way of like acknowledging it and finding our own ways to, yeah, like acknowledge the history and then continue some, yeah, like continue like what we enjoy celebrating, but in a very like mindful and respectful way, which I think is really cool.
I agree. Your generation is going to save the world. You know this, don't you?
Thank you very much to both of you.
Yeah.
Thank you for everything said and for participating. We really appreciate it, seriously. It means a lot.
Thank you for asking us.
Yeah, it's been really, really, really nice.
I also think that, as Rachel was saying in the interview, that here in Italy, I don't know in the rest of Europe, but at least here in Italy, in schools and in general in our culture, we don't really talk about, especially the Australian situation, much. So I think your words and everything you said is a gift for everyone. And even if people might not agree or anything, I think all you said will definitely be useful to let people think about it if they've never thought about it, or at least listen to a point of view. And for us personally, it has been a gift, as it has been for our 5 months in Australia 4 years ago. Oh my God.
My goodness.
We are old.
Lovely.
Do we conclude something in Italian?
Yes, please.
Vai Gio.
Io, vabbè, insomma, grazie mille a tutte e a tutti quelli che hanno ascoltato. Speriamo che abbiate capito tutto. Abbiamo cercato di parlare in maniera chiara. Loro due sono molto brave nel farsi capire, diciamo, in inglese. Sanno che saranno ascoltate da persone che non parlano inglese come prima lingua. Comunque, se avete qualche problema di capire, potete sicuramente contattarci sui social, per email, numeri di cellulare per chi ce li ha. E niente, grazie mille a tutti per averci ascoltati e speriamo sinceramente che queste interviste, le parole di Mika e Miss Teichmann possano davvero essere un patrimonio della nostra cultura e di tutti quelli che ci seguono e ci ascoltano. Okay, I think maybe we can turn off the recording now.
Okay.